everybody, and welcome to Dissecting Fiction with me, Christiaan, and just me this time. We're going to be doing a more experimental episode, and it's probably going to be our first anime episode where we take a deep dive into some anime franchises. It's probably going to be more down the pipeline in this year, and let us know if you like this kind of content. Moving forward, we'll be more than happy to research and talk about and, discuss franchises. But our first episode is going to be a anime franchise near and dear to me, and it is Yu-Gi-Oh! If you remember from our top 20 TV shows, I put Yu-Gi-Oh! Number 20 just because I've been following this franchise for 20 years, and it felt like lying if I said, it probably wasn't one of my favorite animes, despite all its twists and turns. So before we start talking about Yu-Gi-Oh!, I do also want to talk about how this episode's going to be structured a bit. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is actually pretty cleanly structured with how the anime is airing. There is the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, and then there is spin-offs about every 4 years or so. And these spin-offs usually nicely coincide with new mechanics they introduce and the way they begin to publish the manga, the anime, and the card games and things like that. So I'll be going through each Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and then pointing out new things here and there that they introduce to the card game and anime each time. Because I think that's the easiest way to understand Yu-Gi-Oh! Is through the anime, which is probably the most accessible form of Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's probably the easiest form of Yu-Gi-Oh! To find outside of the card game, which you can kind of find anywhere, but I think the card game is incredibly hard to understand. And a lot of times the new stuff in the card game coincides just with the anime. So I'll be going one by one, pointing out each of the new animes, when they aired, how they ended, and then some of the new card game mechanics they introduced in each one of them. So we're going to take a deep dive into Yu-Gi-Oh! And I hope you enjoy this episode. In America, we're used to all these franchises being owned by mega corporations, but in Japan, there are a few of those big companies like Square Enix and Nintendo. But more than likely, there is one license holder, and then they sell that license to other companies. That's how you have Konami publishing the card game, but not actually owning the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime or manga. In America, we go to our comic book stores every week, pick up the latest issues, and then go back home. In Japan, it functions a lot differently. You can buy comic books in convenience stores, and they're often anthology magazines. They have about 100 to maybe 200 pages, and they contain a bunch of different stories. The biggest of these anthology mangas is Weekly Shonen Jump, a manga that exists under the Lunger Jump Company owned by Shueisha, which also owns mangas that produce things like Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto, Bleach. Basically, any anime franchise you probably ever heard of was probably under Jump at one point. Weekly Shonen Jump is specifically targeted to young boys, but of course it has an extremely wide appeal. How the manga market finds new stories to publish is that editors take submissions from artists across Japan. If an editor likes a manga they got, they will publish in Shonen Jump. Then readers, every week, they will pick up the magazine and then read through it. And at the back, there's usually a form for you to fill out. This doesn't happen as much anymore because most of it's digital now, but they do ask the readers to fill out polls and then, mail it back to them. And that's how editors and the company figures out what readers and creators like. And if a manga gets popular enough, Shonen Jump would then license that manga to other companies to make toys, video games, anime, things like that out of it. But here comes the bigger concern. Manga artists have to create chapters every week for Weekly Shonen Jump. Of course, it's a weekly anthology magazine. But what this means in practice is that a manga artist is pumping out about 20 pages a week for their story. Unlike American markets, there is not an individual writer, editor, colorist, letterer, or anything like that. The manga creator is responsible for the manga from top to bottom. They create the outlines, they write the dialogue, they create the characters, they draw the characters, they do everything. Successful manga artists can hire assistants to help with inking and paneling. Most manga artists have to draw, blot, ink, letter the comic on their own with input from editors every single week. It is an insane work environment, and I think that's why you often see a lot of stories repeated over and over again. This is important to how Yu-Gi-Oh! Functions a lot later on, but it's also important to see how this market, how the demand on artists is so insane, affects a lot of anime franchises. I'll probably refer to this episode when we do other anime episodes going forward. For example, during the Cell Saga of Dragon Ball Z, that was somewhat famously directed by the editor. At this point, the manga creator was really tired and he didn't really know what to do with the story anymore. He's been writing the story for like 20 years at this point. And he kept having different villains. I'm sure if anybody's familiar with the Cell Saga, there's a lot of different villains coming in and out. First there was Dr. Gero, then there was Android 17 and 18, then there was Cell, and then there was finally Perfect Cell. This was because whenever the manga artist was submitting his proposals in, the editor was saying he didn't like this, he didn't like that, and he had the villain kept changing. And because the manga artist was so burnt out, he just kept rolling with the changes, and that's how you have the Cell Saga, and why we have Perfect Cell now, is because he was too tired and he was just coming up with different designs. So back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Like I said, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was created by Kazuki Takahashi and began running as a manga in Weekly Shonen Jump on September 30th, 1996. The story changes a lot as it goes forward, like how I just explained, you're working on a weekly basis, so plans change. But super broadly, the story follows a boy named Yugi Moto who solves the ancient Millennium Puzzle, unlocking a secret alter ego called Yami Yugi. He has a real name, but that's a mystery for later on, who is later revealed to be an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Yukimoto attempts to solve the secret of the pharaoh as he attempts to win shadow games against ancient evil forces. Yu-Gi-Oh!, for those that are curious, translates roughly to King of Game or Game King. A big theme to Takahashi is friendship, to the point that the main character's initials, Yugimoto and Joey, or Shouchi in Japan, their initials spell out friendship in Japanese. You can see this even in the first episode, which when they make that smiley face on their hands to defeat Kaiba. And it is also why Yugi and Joey are the main focuses for a lot of the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's because they are essentially the main character and their friendship triumphs over evil. The inspiration for Takahashi to make Yu-Gi-Oh! Was because he was kind of sick of quote-unquote battle manga. Battle manga, for those that don't know, think like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, Bleach, those kinds of things where the main focus is the fighting in it. Takahashi wanted to create characters that would fight each other using puzzles and games and things like that, where, in his words, a weak, childish boy would become a hero when he plays games. This is also inspired by Takahashi's own love of games, such as blackjack and tabletop RPGs. In some interviews, he even talks about how much he would rather be procrastinating and playing games rather than drawing his manga. The very earliest chapters of Yu-Gi-Oh! Had nothing to do with card games, weirdly enough. Instead, Yugimoto would punish bullies or other villains through various games. Of course, he would use his magic to make them into shadow games, and the manga had a much darker tone. He would lure these villains into shadow games where his alter ego, Yami Yugi, would beat them and then serve them an ironic twist of fate, like turning a pretty girl bully ugly because she couldn't solve a puzzle in time. Some of the examples of the games they played were simple dice rolls, jigsaw puzzles, and even Russian roulette. Yu-Gi-Oh! Wouldn't have a card game in it until chapters 9 and 10, which is where you get the famous chapters of Seto Kaiba, the Blue Eyes White Dragons, and Exodia, and all that other fun stuff. This card game was inspired by Magic the Gathering and was referred to as Magics and Wizards in these chapters. Of course, this was a one and done. They only played this card game once, with, Yami Yugi beating Seto Kaiba and his Blue Eyes White Dragons with Exodia. But these chapters are so popular that the editor was getting calls about it from fans. The editor and Takahashi then agreed they would shift focus to the card game, as Takahashi would later admit he was running out of games to come up with, for games for them to play. It is also notable at this point there was a big collector craze going on in Japan, with Pokemon and Digimon at its peak, and even America with like Beanie Babies and stuff. But the shift to card games and just card games alone would not occur until chapter 60, which is about a year later, and would also come with a change in tone. The manga was far less rooted in horror and was aimed to appeal to kids of all ages and just all ages in general. On April 4th, 1998, the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime would premiere in Japan. This anime was produced by Toei Animation, which makes things like Dragon Ball, and adopted the first 59 chapters of the manga, so basically everything before is shifted to just card games. This anime is often regarded by fans as Season 0, since it's never really referenced by the franchise and was only ever aired in Japan. Season 0 would adopt chapters 9 and 10, with Seto Kaiba, Exodia, and Blue Eyes White Dragon, and all that stuff. But this episode would decide to give Kaiba green hair, which is why sometimes in the very early days of the show premiering in the West, you saw clips of Kaiba with green hair. It was just a weird animation quirk Toei gave him. During this time, the manga was deep in its card game mark, and in early 1998, Bandai would try to license the Yu-Gi-Oh! License to develop a card game. However, the card game was very unpopular at first, and lasted only into 1999 and was pretty heavily criticized for its poor art design, its really bad mechanics, and for premiering in a pretty crowded market. Season 0 would end on October 10th, 1998, lasting only 24 episodes, but it would receive a follow-up movie in 1999 to cap up the whole anime. On April 8th, 2000, Nihon Ad Systems, or NAS, and TV Tokyo would produce a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime through Studio Gallop called Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Masters. This is the version that premiered in the West, and this is the version that everyone is familiar with. This adapted everything from chapter 60 onward. So this is all your Pegasus, your Weevil Underworld, your Exodias, your Blue Eyes, your Dark Magicians. This is where all this comes from. At the same time, Konami began distributing the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game after they got the license, and they began it by featuring special promo cards in 1999 through pachinko machines. When the anime began to air in 2000, Konami then began to create starter decks and booster packs. On September 29th, 2001, Yu-Gi-Oh! Premiered on Kids WB, with the famous 4Kids Entertainment obtaining the license for dubbing and distribution in the West. Then, in 2002, Upper Deck would gain the rights to distribute the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game in all territories outside of Asia. Because of release schedules and promos, the card pool was different for every market outside of Japan. This led to two different formats, the Japanese OCG and the everywhere else TGC. Both had the same exact rules, but they just have different cards available to them. And that's just because of how the Japanese card market works, in which they create a lot of promo cards to just promote things. And a lot of those tend not to come over until much later in the West. Needless to say, the show was a huge hit. I was super into the show, and I tried to collect a lot of the cards. I was never very good at the game, but I would play every week at my local card shop with an Exodia deck, and I lost every single weekend. But I just really enjoyed playing the game. It's funny looking back now that Exodia is considered so powerful, but in practice, if you played by the rules like you were supposed to, it's kind of a terrible deck. But I think the success of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is mostly due to how its cards looked and how weird and like dark the animation style was for its time. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put up, of course, pictures and things like that of the cards, but there's a lot of weird horror themes to the card art early on. I think a big point of interest and an easy example to draw on is the Dark Magician. If you look at the Dark Magician, he's kind of this like, he doesn't look like a magician at all. He doesn't look like a wizard at all. He's like this really cool guy in armor, and he has really weird hat and everything. And it's just a really striking design. And I think that's what helped elevate Yu-Gi-Oh! Ahead of all its peers, is that it had really striking designs a lot of the time. Even things like the Blue Eyes White Dragon. You look at the Blue Eyes White Dragon, it doesn't really look like a traditional dragon at all. Like its head is really smooth, but its body is like really weird and jagged. It's not like a very traditional war-looking Western dragon, or even like a more traditional Easter dragon. It's kind of a weird combination of the two, but it's a very striking design, and I think that helped elevate the card game a lot. I also do want to get into what I think the appeal of the show is outside of the card game art. Because a lot of people, I think, look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Originally and say, like, well, this is so ridiculous. How do you watch a show about people playing card games? Like, that's such a weird thing to watch. I like to compare Yu-Gi-Oh! To wrestling a lot because I think wrestling and Yu-Gi-Oh! Follow a lot of the same, like, structures, just, like, narratively. And they also follow a lot of the same, like, kind of entertainment tenets. Like, in wrestling, you're watching two people pretend to fight each other. There is a lot of athleticism involved. They are actually moving around. They are actually hitting each other. But they are ultimately pretending to fight each other. There are moments where they do actually get hurt. I'm not going to deny that. They are performing incredible feats of the body. But it is in service of the story. They're trying to build a story with their bodies. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is somewhat similar in that they're trying to build a story, just not with the overarching narrative, but with how they play. They're building a story with cards. Because as we get later down in Yu-Gi-Oh!, this isn't the case first. What decks people play is based on their personality, and how they play is based on their personality. It's kind of similar how, like, in wrestling, you have people like the Big Show. He fights very differently than how the Undertaker fights, or how, like, John Cena, they all fight differently from each other. And how that plays is part of their character and part of the narrative they're trying to build. And that's what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of about. But there's also a bigger narrative in Yu-Gi-Oh! About, like, mysteries and things like that. It's not just the characters building a story with how they fight each other. They're also doing a larger story to that. And I think a good Yu-Gi-Oh! Like series and show does a lot to set up stakes, like what they're fighting for and how they're fighting for that. And I think that shares a lot of similarities with the wrestlers. Like, a good wrestling match has very clear stakes. If they're just fighting, it's kind of boring. But you always see with the main show, there's very clear stakes. Like, before they go in the ring, they say, I want this, I want you to do that, and I'm going to do this. And again, Yu-Gi-Oh's like that. They say, like, I have this deck. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just a fucking surprise, and that makes it really cool. But they always say, I want to do this. I want to find this out from you. I want this from you. So I think if you ever try watching Yu-Gi-Oh, you should try to, like, push the card game out of your mind a bit and focus a bit more on the narrative. I mean, of course, the card game's there. The card game's the main focus. And how they play the cards is important. But if that's like a roadblock for you, just try to think a bit about wrestling, because I think if you enjoy wrestling, you can enjoy this. Because in a lot of ways, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has crazy plots like wrestling, but even crazier because it is an anime, and they can push the stakes as far as they want. They can push the narratives as far as they want. They can fight in space. They can fight in other dimensions. They can fight evil gods. They can do anything. And wrestling has that sometimes. Like, hell, the Undertaker is an undead monster who's supposed to be unbeatable. And because of that, they use that to make stories out of it. And Yu-Gi-Oh's similar to that. So I just wanted to preface that before we get too deep into Yu-Gi-Oh! But with everything now premiering, this is also where things diverge quite a bit. A massive delay in the manga would occur in 2003 during the final arc of the manga, when Takahashi experienced a stomach ulcer that caused him to vomit blood. He was missing up to 1/3 of his blood when he actually arrived to the hospital. His doctors said it was because of stress, likely from making a weekly manga. Because of this, he had to cut significant portions of his manga in his final arc, and caused him to really cut corners on a lot of designs and story outlines, because he was just trying to rush it out once he got out of the hospital. And I'm assuming he even worked in the hospital too. But since the anime is aired weekly with a team instead of just one guy, production would have to continue so the anime could keep its time slot instead of just going off the air. This caused the anime team to create what we call filler arcs, where they just made up something so they could eventually have some kind of manga material to adapt some point down the line. A lot of the more famous Yu-Gi-Oh arcs from the first anime are filler arcs. These arcs are the Virtual World arc, where they would go to the virtual world and fight Noah and the Kaiba Corp chairman. The Waking the Dragon arc, or the Atlantis arc with the Seal of Orichalcos. And then the Kaiba Grand Champions, which I don't recall ever seeing on TV, because I think at that point they were just kind of airing things out of order. This is also why the Virtual World arc happens in the middle of the Battle City finals. It was just to pad for time for Takahashi to make something. Also, because the anime and manga didn't have a card game in mind when it started, a lot of the rules and mechanics were just made up on the fly. It wasn't until much later that the manga, anime, and even the official card game came up with a coherent identity for what the Yu-Gi-Oh card game even was. For example, Konami was just kind of stabbing in the air, thinking of what could be cool, and they wound up creating now several infamously broken cards, such as Yadagaratsu, Magical Scientist, and Blackluster Dragon, Envoy of the End. Or they would just adapt things from the anime and make them basically unplayable, like the Toon Monsters from the anime where Maximilian Pegasus used. They were incomprehensible when they were first released. You had no idea how to play them. It was just a wall of text. And on some of those Toon Monster cards, they actually ran out of room to write text, and they just didn't finish the effects. Another famous example of how Konami ran the card game early on is that there's a famous 2,222 card deck from one of the first Konami-sponsored tournaments in the West, because tournaments just did not have a deck limit. And this guy's strategy was to just waste the other players' time until they just forfeited. Eventually, they did come up with some more formal rules. In the manga, they were not established until the Battle City arc, in which Kaiba hosts a giant tournament across an entire city. And this was also the arc right after Pegasus being defeated. I also remember as a kid, many of the cards Konami printed were not shown in the anime until much later on, and a lot of the cards in the show were not printed into the game much later on. For example, the Egyptian Guard cards I don't think were printed until like 2008 in the West, which is weird because they were here in the anime like in 2004. Also, the video games, since they were just being adapted and they had no idea what the game was, the video games for Yu-Gi-Oh! Were barely card games. They were just random ideas like people had about what the card game could be. For example, the PS1 game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories, is basically vastly different from any version of the game ever played, and the PS2 game, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses, was a strange RTS hybrid where Kaiba and Yugimoto were the two sides of the War of Roses from English history, where Henry VIII was trying to fight for the throne of London and England and all of the realms thereof. Also, the American and Japanese versions of the anime are vastly, vastly different. The American dub would change entire portions of the plot and then also Americanize a lot of the names, but it would also change card designs and like what people did. One of the biggest infamous changes 4Kids would make dubbing the show is to exclude any mention of violence or death. The Japanese version of the anime had people dying all the time in it or having their souls stolen, while 4Kids now made the iconic change of, instead of people dying, they were just sent to the Shadow Realm. So if you ever watch the anime again and somebody's sent to the Shadow Realm, it's because they died, and 4Kids just had to find a way to write around that. And they said, oh no, they're not dead. Their souls were just sent to the Shadow Realm. And it's weird to think that something as iconic as the Shadow Realm in Yu-Gi-Oh! Was just something a dubber made up somewhere down the way. In 2004, both the anime and the manga would come to a close in Japan. The manga would end on March 8th, 2004, while the anime would air its final episode on September 29th, 2004. The very last arc, the Ceremonial Duel, is a great cap-off to all these characters we would not see for many, many years again. 2004, however, was the height of Yu-Gi-Oh! In America, Warner Brothers and 4Kids Entertainment and Studio Gallop would then produce the Pyramid of Light movie on August 13th, 2004, which is not well received by anyone and is not considered canon anymore. But this movie follows Yami Yugi attempting to defeat the ancient Egyptian god Anubis, a character that would never be mentioned again. Later that same year, 4Kids' involvement would also see them try to produce a mini-series spin-off for the show called Capsule Monsters. For those not familiar with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, Capsule Monsters was a one-time game they played in one of the episodes that became fairly iconic because it was like a mixer between the card game and like a traditional board game like Warhammer. And they tried to make a show out of that, and I think it only lasted 12 episodes. This would premiere in 2006, just before the final arc of the anime in America. The American version would finish broadcasting in 2006, leaving a deep impact on the industry, likely paving the way for shows like Naruto and One Piece. To be clear, before this there was only a few anime that were really being broadcasted in American televisions. There was things like Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, Pokemon, and things like that, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Was one of the big other franchises that appeared, and I think it really helped bring over some of these other mature shows from Weekly Shonen Jump, like, again, Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, and I really helped pave the way for making an anime fan market in America outside of a really niche audience. In Japan, the end of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime was followed up a week later by a spin-off called Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, and this would air on October 6, 2004. GX stands for Generation Next, and it sees the cast of Yu-Gi-Oh! Replaced by a new cast and setting, taking place in the same universe, but roughly about a decade after the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! The show follows Judai Yuki, or Jaden Yuki in the dub, attending Duel Academy, a school where students are specifically taught how to play Duel Monsters, which is what, in the show, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game is called. It's called Duel Monsters, not Yu-Gi-Oh! Anyway, Jaden Yuki has the ability to talk to quote-unquote card spirits. There's a lot more to the show, like the school gets sent to another dimension and they have to duel aliens and spirits. It gets really wacky, like a lot of Yu-Gi-Ohs, and that's what makes it a lot of fun. Starts up simple, but becomes very strange and very mature. I really liked it, though there is a shit ton of filler in this show. Also, when I was rewatching a lot of these episodes for research for this episode, it was interesting to see how the duels worked in Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a lot less bullshit and a lot more focus on mechanics and how decks work. For example, the main character has a superhero-themed deck, and he fuses these heroes together to find the proper heroes to win a fight. In the original, anime, the first anime with Yugi Muto, they just kind of summoned stuff, and sometimes the stuff was good and sometimes the stuff was bad. And there was a lot of episodes where you were just waiting for the character to draw the right card to win the game with. Likely because now everyone had rules to work off of, and they didn't just have to make up random shit all the time. The premiere of Yu-Gi-Oh! GX in Japan was also followed by a short spin-off manga called Yu-Gi-Oh! R, and that was published on June 2004, mere months after the end of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. But this manga was published in V-Jump, a magazine centered around gaming content, also under the larger Jump brand. You'll hear the name V-Jump a lot, because a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga spin-offs are published in V-Jump. However, interestingly, this manga was not written or drawn by Takahashi, but by Akira Ito, one of his assistants. From now on, Takahashi would not be drawing most of anything in Yu-Gi-Oh! His role would basically be incredibly relaxed throughout the rest of this franchise, and he had little direct involvement in either R or GX. Instead, Takahashi became kind of like a supervisor of the franchise, almost like a story advisor. Think of how George Lucas kind of was towards the beginning of the Disney acquisition, where, they would call him in and ask him for advice, but they also kind of just did their own thing. However, Takahashi would also design monsters and help come up with broad story beats, but the anime was mostly left to its own devices, as it was composed of a lot of veterans from the first series. And due to the accessibility of the anime, it became the driving force of the franchise to sell its merchandise. Some of the stuff Takahashi would draw later on in Yu-Gi-Oh! Would be most of the main characters. There are some exceptions we'll get into. And he would also draw a lot of the hero's main ace card, the card they would play all the time to win the duel. If you look at a lot of the Takahashi's designs around them, there's a lot of Western influence, which is really cool. A lot of them are based on superheroes from the West. Interestingly, one of Takahashi's favorite comic books is Hellboy, and him and Mike Mignola did a little art trade in about 2004 that I will put up on the screen. It's really fun and cute. It has Hellboy wearing the Millennium Puzzle. However, after the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! R in V-Jump, there was a manga adaptation published of GX on December 17th, 2004. Because of the separation between the anime and the manga, a lot of the plot points for the manga of GX are pretty different from what happened in the anime. This will be kind of the case for every Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga going forward. The manga would contain the same characters as the anime, but they would have different motivations, different backstories, sometimes different cards, and there are like two different stories drawn from the same outline. So they have the same characters, but just like nothing else similar to each other. But a lot of the manga is not really referenced, and it's mostly the anime that's really driving things now. And the manga is just really an adaptation to fill up page space in V-Jump from now on. Now back to America. The dub of GX would finally begin airing in America in 2005, confusingly, as the original was still airing. I remember absolutely hating the dub as a kid because the dub was extremely goofy, it's really loud, characters are always attempting to make really cheesy jokes, and absolutely destroys the tone of the show. I also remember a lot of people kind of becoming disinterested with the show around here, and I think this is kind of where the Yu-Gi-Oh! Hype really dies down. It has a fan base at this point, but is no longer the colossal thing as it once was. To perhaps show how bad this dub was, the last arc of the show was never dubbed in the West. It was instead cancelled and replaced by the next Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. There was a proposed film project called Yu-Gi-Oh! Vs. GX that was developed by Takahashi, but only this idea was scrapped. This movie was meant to cap off the entire franchise. The idea of Yu-Gi-Oh! Vs. GX was based on Mazinger Z vs. Devilman, a movie that heavily inspired Takahashi as he was a kid. And the movie would see Yukimoto and Jurayuki partner up to fight some kind of threat and then duel each other to cap off the movie. The movie was never materialized, but a lot of the structure was incorporated into the GX anime, mostly during Season 2, and there was eventually a final duel between Yugi and Judai at the end of the anime. The card game also found a very clear identity at this point with very clear rules, bandlets, tones, and strategies. It's really at this point Yu-Gi-Oh! Fell into what is now called their archetypes, which are cards with similar names that interact with each other on some level, and it basically established as a continuing titan of the card game industry. This is also where Yu-Gi-Oh! Found its identity against Magic and Pokemon. Yu-Gi-Oh! Would not focus on resources like Magic, where you had to tap lands to do stuff, or Pokemon, where you had to use energy cards. Instead, Yu-Gi-Oh! Focused a lot on playing big monsters and having those big monsters do stuff. It's fun, but it also gets incredibly complicated incredibly quick. Konami also began producing a ton of video games at these times, mostly just adaptations of the card game, just in like a Game Boy cartridge or something. And they found a very comfortable formula for the games, basically creating a new handheld game about every year or so. On April 2nd, 2008, a week after Yu-Gi-Oh! GX ended, the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, began airing. This series would begin a new trend in Yu-Gi-Oh! Takahashi was super reluctantly involved with this series, sick of working on Yu-Gi-Oh! At this point, and only promised to be involved with 5Ds if it was the last Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. Of course, that never happened, obviously. He mainly did it because he was longtime friends with a lot of the production staff and he wanted to do another, series to help keep them employed. 5Ds, which stands for Five Dragons, takes place in the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! And it is a world divided by class. The main character, Yusai Fudo, a motorcycle duelist, tries to escape the oppressive class system and win back his ace card from his biker gang rival, Jack Atlas. As usual, like most Yu-Gi-Ohs, much more happens as the plot eventually spirals out of control into cults, eldritch gods, time travel, and time-traveling robots. This anime series is somewhat famous for having many of the duels take place on motorcycles, called turbo duels, and for adding a new type of monster, synchro monsters. Synchro monsters would heavily speed up the flow of the card game compared to a lot of the previous special monsters like fusion and ritual monsters. Turbo duels were never actually adapted into the card game because a lot of how turbo duels worked was how fast your motorcycle was going. Now I'm sure a lot of you thinking, so they're playing card games on motorcycles now? Yes, they are, and it's actually really dumb, but incredibly brilliant concept. A big problem of a lot of the early Yu-Gi-Oh! Duels is that ultimately you're just watching two characters stand there and just play a card game against each other. They would try to solve these problems in the anime and manga by having it in a more exciting setting, like maybe they're fighting on a blimp, maybe they're fighting over lava, just to add some more stakes. But the idea of putting them on like a moving vehicle and having them like be in charge of that vehicle is actually a really good idea because it allows you to change the scenery and create some kind of space where the characters are more moving and interacting with each other without having to actually do all that much movement and interaction. They're just on a motorcycle and they're playing a card game against each other. And it actually does add a lot of like movement and tension to a lot of these fights. It also added some level of variety in that there was now a turbo duel setting and now a standard duel setting. So you could see characters play on motorcycles, or you could see them play sometimes just doing the normal standing around stuff. The first 64 episodes are really highly regarded by fans as being some of the best of the show, because it is very, like, as you can probably tell from that plot description, very, like, 80s inspired and very just, like, grungy and weird and just very, like, macho. It's a lot of fun. But the rest of the show is really frowned upon because it is really bad and has a lot of long, boring duels. For example, the entire second half of the series is one giant, long, drawn-out tournament arc. Which, tournament arcs are usually an anime staple classic, but when it's lasting for like 80 episodes, tournament arcs get old real fast. This is also the point where Konami had a lot more direct involvement with the franchise. To introduce the new mechanics of synchro summons and synchro monsters, Konami created special arcade machines called the Duelist Terminals, and they would set up these terminals across Japan in arcades, and they were built specifically to help new players understand, and old players understand, the new synchro mechanic, and they would also print out cards as prizes. These terminals featured the characters from the show, but also had news stories based around the cards, making like a card lore similar to Magic's ongoing storylines that they have, specifically told to just the cards. These machines, these duelist terminals, would be updated or replaced every 6 months or so. There was also a slew of new games for consoles that were still being produced, alongside the arcade machines and the card game. However, the terminals never really made its way across the West, and the cards became increasingly harder to find, coinciding with the show's waning popularity. However, the fan base for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game became bigger again at this point because the synchro summons and the synchro monsters weren't incredibly well received at first. They, again, helped speed up the game. I won't get too much into how, but they helped speed up the game and were kind of like just a simple addition of some of their discarded mechanics. Another example of Konami's involvement was with the Blackwing monster cards. The Blackwings were an anime card that one of the characters used, and they were basically just bird people. But for some reason, the Blackwing cards were incredibly popular in Japan. Konami basically forced the anime staff to keep that character around, and have that character become one of the feature characters. Because originally, I think they were planning to turn this character that used Black Wings into a villain and have him killed off. But Konami said no, his cards are too popular, you keep him the fuck around. Also around this time, one of the voice actresses for this show turned out to be in a BDSM cult, and they had to fire her. According to rumors, this character was supposed to be a big plot point character, but between Konami saying you had to keep certain characters around, and this voice actress suddenly being in some kind of BDSM cult, they had to basically completely throw away everything and start from scratch. This caused the production to fire the actress and completely changed the plot to a sci-fi story instead of its weird kind of pseudo-sci-fi, pseudo-fantasy setting. The rest of the show, the production was constantly in chaos, perhaps explaining why there's 80 episodes of a fucking tournament arc. Another manga adaptation of the show was published in 2009, again, a year after the anime began airing, and 4Kids would then begin to air their dub of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds in the Americas in 2008. The anime dub would bounce from show to show, from channel to channel, as Warner Brothers continually changed the programming blocks, thanks to acquisitions and mergers at this point. Bouncing 5Ds from like CW4Kids to Cartoon Network to Toonzai. Because of all these changes, a lot of episodes were left unaired and the show was ultimately uncompleted. So besides Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds becoming a kind of nice addition to the franchise and helping to flesh out everything, and meant originally as a cap-off, Konami would get embroiled in a massive lawsuit with Upper Deck, the publisher of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game everywhere outside of Asia. And Konami alleged that Upper Deck was essentially forging cards in an attempt to undercut Konami. Eventually, the lawsuit was settled out of court, but Upper Deck was forced to cease production on Yu-Gi-Oh! Immediately, and Konami would then take over the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game for global distribution. So now, Konami published all the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card games all across the world. And because of this, there was some minor changes to the card game, but it basically kept the same. But this would not be the only lawsuit the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise got embroiled in. In 2011, 4Kids Entertainment, the creators of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Dub, was sued by NAS and TV Tokyo, the creator of just the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, alleging 4Kids underpaid on royalties and conspired with Funimation to produce the show without NAS and TV Tokyo, effectively cutting them out of the market. NAS and TV Tokyo would sue 4Kids Entertainment for $5 million in compensation. Now, this is a wild accusation to make, but as 4Kids began to reorganize their finances to fight that lawsuit, they found out most of their money had been poorly invested by the Lehman Brothers in auction rate securities. Essentially, this is 2011, right when the financial crash was really going in America, and Lehman Brothers was one of the big investors that really fucked up people's cash. And it turned out they also really fucked up 4Kids' cash. So after a very long series of legal disputes and financial mumbo-jumbo that lasted for years, 4Kids would cease operations in 2016, but its dubbing branch would be bought by Konami, effectively making Konami the controlling company of the Yu-Gi-Oh! License. They now had control of both the card game and the anime in all overseas markets. To this day, Konami still owns the rights, but has rebranded 4Kids as 4K Media, and then later rebranded 4K Media as Konami Cross Media. It now exists basically to manage the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime brand outside of Japan. So with the end of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds in 2011, most of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise was now consolidating under Konami and its Japanese owners. However, there is one final tidbit before we move on. In 2010, as 5Ds was nearing its final arc, the movie Yu-Gi-Oh! Beyond Times was released to celebrate 10 years of the NAS anime. It was, of course, 3D because it is an early 2010s movie. The movie saw Yami Yugi, Judai Yuki, and Yusei Fudo partner up to fight a time travel villain. The movie isn't very good, but it marks the first time Yami Yugi is back in the narrative since the ending of Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2004. It also, unsurprisingly, was not well received. Despite it being a team-up movie to what Takahashi originally wanted with GX, Takahashi had no involvement in production, and as such, this movie is now considered non-canon. The Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds ended in both Japan and America in 2011, and then was immediately followed up by Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal on April 11th, 2011, that same exact year and a week later, as usual. This series is broadly divided between Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexals and Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexals the Second. They're the same series, but they're just basically a way to divide the arcs. Again, this series saw only minor involvement from Takahashi, designing only the main character and his ace monster, and having no involvement with the story beats or any of the other characters. This show is really heavily structured towards a younger audience, and an audience that isn't distinctly familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of the early episodes of this show are about the main character kind of learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! This show also introduces a new mechanic called XZ Monsters. They were similar to Synchro Monsters, but are a bit more mechanically accessible in the card game, like any deck can use them. Synchro Monsters were a very specific deck way to build, not to get too deep into it. The show follows Yuma Tsukumo, who discovers an ancient alien being named Astral, whose memories are missing and contained within 100 different numbers cards. The show does expand from just collecting cards into an interstellar war with interdimensional aliens. A lot of the show is based around ideas of virtual reality instead of holograms like previous series. Holograms are a big involvement in a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but here they focus a lot more on virtual reality. Only a part of the show was aired by 4Kids before Konami took over the rights, like I explained earlier in the lawsuit. But due to networks dying left and right in the 2000s, Zexals was bounced from station to station before being simply streamed straight to Hulu from episode 104 onward in 2013. There was also a manga adaptation of Zexal in V-Jump in 2011. Unlike other Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, this one did not focus on a very broad mythology. For example, 5Ds focused on Incan mythology. Zexal took a lot more inspiration from Greek and Christian mythology, with a lot of the ideas based around stars and numerology. Some of the main villains of Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexals are based on the names of the Big Dipper, like the star constellation the Big Dipper. So on April 6, 2014, Zexal was followed by the maligned Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V. Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V is meant to be an anniversary season, being aired during the 20th anniversary of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise since the first publication of the manga. If you remember back to Beyond's Before Time, that was meant to be the 10th anniversary of the NAS anime. So this is the 20th anniversary of just the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise period. The plot of Arc V follows Yuya, an entertainment duelist who seeks to redeem his disgraced dad and find the mystery behind his dad's disappearance. After several mysterious characters show up, Yuya begins to time travel across dimensions and stuff, and tries to solve an interdimensional war. Each of the dimensions he travels to are one of the previous anime seasons, so you get to see a lot of fan favorites come out of the woodwork, and Yuya is essentially interacting with a lot of fan favorites, and it's kind of neat. The show is also notable for having multiple summoning methods instead of one core method. For example, going back to 5Ds, 5Ds would only have synchro summons, or Zexal would only have XZ summons. Arc V had every type of summon in it. This made a lot of fights really exciting because you didn't know what kind of cards somebody was going to play, and it also allowed for a big variety of tactics, surprisingly. Now here comes the more controversial part. Arc V also introduced pendulum summoning as a card game mechanic, and this is also a mechanic that caused a lot of players to quit, as they became radically different. It changed the playing field, it changed how the rules work, and it also introduced a lot of extremely powerful cards. Pendulum summoning is kind of like, I throw up images of the cards on the screen, but they're basically both a magic card and a monster card at the same time. And how you play it as a monster card on a spell card means different things to the effect of that monster. But because of that, basically every card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now have at least two effects. And it made a lot of cards really bloated and really hard to understand. And this is why a lot of players quit, because there's just too much going on. And the field became entirely different because you had specific parts of the field dedicated to just this mechanic. And people just got furious about it. So people began leaving, and also around this time, you also see a lot of Tier 0 decks popping up, which are decks that dominate the game. You see a lot of them show up here, and also in the earliest beginnings of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, and back in like 2001. Also, this anime season also looked down upon for having several long, uninteresting duels and extremely long arcs after the very first arc, which is actually really well received by fans, because that first arc is really well structured. But once they start going to other Yu-Gi-Oh franchises, the plot gets really confusing, and it gets really long and drawn out, and it becomes kind of impossible to watch. Many of the writers that had worked on the show had been working on the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise since its inception, and I've read some people attribute like this long time working on the franchise, like that people were just burning out at this point. They didn't know what to make anymore. They were just getting incredibly burnt out. Arc V also wouldn't have a manga at first, but instead it would have a one-shot in V-Jump on May 21st, 2014, and then eventually it would get a full adaptation on August 24th, 2015. There was also a comedy, like gag comic, that was being published in V-Jump on April 3rd, 2015. The gag comic only lasted like 5 months before getting canceled. This anime series also saw Konami beginning to veer away from making so many Yu-Gi-Oh! Video games, and basically only produced like 3 video games for the entirety of Arc V, which is weird. And that's just directly coincide with the exact 20th anniversary of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise. On April 23rd, 2016, as Studio Gal was producing the Arc V's final arc, they released the 20th anniversary movie Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Sides of Dimensions. Dark Sides of Dimensions featured the return of Takahashi in a main story role, becoming the writer of the film, and returning to design new cards and card art for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game. He would even draw certain keyframes for some of the film's sequences. The film broadly follows Kaiba attempting to bring back the Pharaoh by forcing Yugimoto to summon him, just so Kaiba can duel him, even as several mysterious forces attempt to stop him. It also features nearly every character from the original anime, and it is very well received by fans of the show. Takahashi would also publish a new one-shot manga called Transcend Game in Weekly Shonen Jump. The 2-part prologue story is set between the end of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga and the beginning of Dark Side of Dimensions. Part 1 was released in the 19th issue on April 11th, 2016, and Part 2 was released on April 18th, 2016. Takahashi would also kind of see a involvement of his art styles as he began to kind of experiment more with digital tech. And if you look at his art around this period, it's a lot cleaner. There's a lot more shading going on as opposed to the more simple style of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga and anime. But also at the same time, to coincide with the 20th anniversary of Yu-Gi-Oh!, TV Tokyo began airing remastered episodes of the original anime in honor of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s 20th anniversary. I know we've been going on for a long time, but we are almost done. Yu-Gi-Oh! Reigns would follow up Arc V on May 17th, 2017 in Japan, and it helped me to rediscover Yu-Gi-Oh! As a franchise. This is because it had simultaneous airings on Japan, but also it would premiere on the Crunchyroll app the same exact dates. So I could watch the Yu-Gi-Oh! Reigns animes as it was directly coming out in Japan. Reigns follows Yusaka Fujiki, also known as Playmaker, a hacker attempting to track down a group of evil hackers called the Knights of Hanoi, who are attempting to destroy all AI in the world. This season is focused much more on the audience, as the main character's driving force is revenge. There's some more complicated plot points, there's a darker tone, and it is just in general more of like trying to be a thriller. I don't know how successful it is at it. I didn't enjoy Reigns as much as some of the others. I think the burnout is somewhat clear. There's also a lot of production problems. There's a lot of really kind of wonky plot going on, but it does have some of the better moments in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise, just like overall. Early on, there is some of the production problems I alluded to. There was heavy studio change-ups early on. After episode 13, the showrunner and director for the show left, and a new showrunner came in. This was also followed by several key members leaving the studio just overall. This resulted in several flashback episodes just to fill time, flashback episodes being just kind of like clip shows of other episodes that came before it. Again, just to fill time. And it also became the shortest running of all the Yu-Gi-Oh! Animes with only 120 episodes. The shortest since NAS took the license, not overall, because there is still that toy animation all the way back in 1998, which was only 24 episodes. Brains, like every other Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise anime at this point, introduced a new card game mechanic, this time called Link Summoning. Originally, Link Summoning enraged players because, once again, the field was drastically changed, but Link Summoning overall became a lot more well-received because it helped slow down the pace of the game from Pendulum Summoning, where you could just fart out monsters from your deck and from your hand, and for just nerfing Pendulum Monsters overall. On January 11th, 2017, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, a mobile version of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game, was released. On January 11th, 2017, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, a mobile version of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game, was released. And it also was part of the reason how I got back into the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. It has since its release replaced all other versions of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game. Some are occasionally released, like Legacy of the Duelist, but they do not nearly have the same production value as Duel Links. Duel Links has kind of become the sole focus of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game franchise at this point. I really enjoyed Duel Links, and it has been really successful digitally. I know I play probably at least every week, and it has some 5 billion downloads worldwide. Downloads, again, is just like a person downloading it, and it also doesn't account for multiple phones. So don't get too riled up over it. However, the card game and the mobile games are vastly different at this point. Duel Links is kind of a stripped down version of just the base card game, since it has a smaller deck and a smaller field size. It also has a much smaller card pool going on. This somewhat allows the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links game to function as its own thing, while also being able to learn from the mistakes of the original card game. A lot of the most powerful cards from the original card game never make its way over, and the experience of knowing what cards break the game are really easily learned in Duel Links, because they have 20 years of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game to look at. Brains originally seemed like it was going to try to advertise Duel Links using a thing called speed duels. They were mechanically similar to the format in Duel Links and saw characters speeding around on hoverboards instead of motorcycles this time. However, Duel Links is never referenced in the show explicitly, and they never really reference any kind of Duel Links-esque system in the anime. It seems like they were originally intending to go that route, but kind of backed out at the last minute. Because there are speed duels, but they just don't call them speed duels anywhere else except for the anime. But at the beginning of 2019, Konami would attempt to print cards called speed duels in America and Japan. These cards basically had the exact same card pool as Duel Links, and it worked as the exact same format as Duel Links, but they were just called speed duels. Particularly, no one plays them because you can just play Duel Links instead. Also, somewhat surprisingly, there was never a manga adaptation of Reigns. Reigns would finish its tumultuous run in 2019. Shortly after, of course, they announced a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Series called Yu-Gi-Oh! Sevens. However, Reigns would not be immediately followed up by Sevens. Instead, a 6-month break was planned, which is shocking. For this entire time, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been kind of running consistently every single week for 20 years at this point. And now, after Reigns, there's a 6-month break to allow Yu-Gi-Oh! Sevens to come up. Alongside this announcement was the other announcement that Sevens would not be animated by Studio Gallup, who has been animating the show since 2000. Instead, the new studio, Bridge, would take over the show. Ironically, I think the show was originally planned to commemorate 20 years of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime since it premiered in 2000. But that team that made that Yu-Gi-Oh! 20 years of Yu-Gi-Oh! Reality would not be working on this anniversary season. No new mechanics have been added this season, shockingly. Instead, a new format called Rush Duels have been added, which is also the main dueling format in the anime. Rush Duels are meant to be extremely fast versions of the game, featuring both new and old cards. These cards have different frames and borders than the ones that have been published for 20 years, with the art now a lot bigger, the stats larger and color-coded, and now directly underneath the card art instead of being right at the bottom. The levels are a big, easy-to-read number instead of you having to count out the levels. And every effect has a clear order of activation and effect. In general, these Rush Duel games are meant to be targeted specifically towards children, being able to just get straight into the card game, being immediately understanding what's going on, instead of having to learn things like timing activations and things like that. Because that's essentially what the main format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Has become. Like, you can just play a card, then have the card not do anything because you accidentally played it at the wrong time. Even though the difference is probably just like one card. If you look at a lot of other popular card games in Japan right now, such as Digimon, the card framing is similar to Digimon in a lot of ways. There's a lot of big, easy to read numbers. You know where everything is. And there's a lot of clear, like the way they organize the text is extremely similar to those other card games, which I think is what they were trying to go for. This is trying to be Yu-Gi-Oh! But a new updated format of Yu-Gi-Oh! For the 2000s. A lot of rumors have been going around saying Konami wants this to be the new format going forward, but there has only been 2 starter decks and 4 mini sets printed in Japan, and they haven't made their way over to the West in any way or fashion, likely because of the coronavirus delaying a lot of plans. Also, the initial trailers for Yu-Gi-Oh! 7 was pretty heavily criticized for its designs and art. A lot of people criticize it for looking like derivatives of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like Card Fighter Vanguard. So it kind of felt like Yu-Gi-Oh! Was trying to be a derivative of itself. It's hard to explain, but if you look at like the art styles, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Just like compare the art style of the first season of Yu-Gi-Oh! To the art style of Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s. It's just different. Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s would finally begin airing on April 28th, 2020. However, only 5 episodes were aired before the COVID pandemic forced the show to go on hiatus, only to resume back up in August 2020. 2 manga were announced to be published. One is a comedy manga spin-off, published in Tsukio Jump, a bi-monthly spin-off of the Jump brand, where they publish spin-offs of the mangas of stuff from the original Shonen Jump, like Dragon Ball. So it's basically like a collection of spin-offs of the spin-offs. And there was another more direct manga spin-off of 7's in V-Jump. Both began publication on August 2020. So far, there has been no announcements or plans to bring either the anime, manga, or new card game format to the West. This is in stark contrast to Konami being dedicated to producing the show internationally through its subsidiaries like Viz Media, which has been adapting the manga into English for basically 20 years at this point, or even through 4K Media, which has been somewhat publishing the dub since it took over in 2016. They've been kind of bad about it. They don't know where to air it most of the time, and I don't know where it gets thrown up. Like, I know there is a dub of Reigns somewhere, but I have no idea how to find it. However, despite all these changes going on, despite 7's kind of looking to change the format of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the main card game in the West has been experiencing a bit of a renaissance right now. I know I've been collecting the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game again. I like collecting the cards. And they have recently celebrated printing their 10,000th unique card with 10,000 Dragon, which is like a $5,000 card because it is extremely rare, but it is also extremely cool to have a print of their now 10,000 cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! I do want to say it is somewhat annoying collecting Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards because Yu-Gi-Oh! Like the company loves to reprint cards all the time. They just love doing it. I have been collecting since maybe 2019, and I've collected maybe 5 separate sets. And in those 5 sets, I probably have copies of like 5 different cards, because A lot of these sets are like collections of like their best of, and also like reprints of older cards. And it's probably better just to collect cards you like instead of trying to collect the whole sets. However, the Yu-Gi-Oh card game is still going on, it's still fairly popular, and it still does pretty well. And the cards are still expensive, and I think even though the game is insanely complicated, it is still fun to play. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our Yu-Gi-Oh episode. I know this has been a kind of long episode with just me and not a whole lot of interaction, but please, please let us know if you like these episodes, if you want more. I do have a Digimon episode planned coming up because there is going to be a new Digimon card game coming to the West pretty soon. I think its planned release is either in February or maybe like more towards March with how things are going on here. So if you'd like to hear more anime episodes, please let us know. I do enjoy researching these and watching these. If you have any desire to collect toys or action figures or statues or things like that, please head over to toystoryguide.com where you can find all your favorite Toy Stories in a nice list in your local area. You can find all kinds of local toy stores that you can go to pick up even like Yu-Gi-Oh figures and Yu-Gi-Oh card games and things like that. So please head over to toystoryguide.com. So please head over to your local stores right now. They need your help, and use toystoryguide.com to do so. This has been Christiaan talking about Yu-Gi-Oh for like an hour. Have a nice day.